The moment my brother's fiancée pointed at me and told the event coordinator to have me escorted out, I didn't say a word. I just stood there in the entrance of the Hargrove Grand, in my black dress, holding my clutch, watching my mother nod slowly like what was happening made complete sense. 3 hours later, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. I let it go to voicemail. I should probably start from the beginning. My name is Claire. I'm 32 years old. I'm the oldest of 2 children, and for as long as I can remember, that title has meant almost nothing in my family. My brother Daniel is 28. He's charming and loud and knows exactly how to walk into a room and make everyone smile. He always has. My parents used to joke that I came out of the womb with a pencil and a measuring tape, and Daniel came out with a spotlight. What they meant and what I understood even as a child was that I was practical and he was the one worth celebrating. I became a structural engineer. Specifically, I work in architectural design and structural systems. I spent 6 years in school, 3 more apprenticing under a firm in Chicago, and then I moved back to our hometown of Millvale, Georgia, to join a mid-size firm called Aldrin & Voss. I've been there 4 years. I don't talk about my work much at family dinners because my mother has a way of nodding at whatever I say with the kind of polite distance she usually reserves for strangers on airplanes. Daniel sells medical devices. He makes good money. He drives a white BMW. He met a woman named Priya 2 years ago, and when he told my parents they were getting engaged, my mother cried happy tears at the kitchen table. I was there for that conversation. I remember sitting across from her, watching her reach for my father's hand, and thinking quietly that when I had told them I'd been promoted to lead engineer on a flagship project the previous spring, she had said, "That's great, honey," and then asked Daniel if he wanted more pasta. I'm not bitter. I want to be clear about that. I spent a long time being bitter, and it didn't do anything except make me feel heavy. What I am is clear-eyed. I understand who my family is. I understand what they value and what they don't. I made peace with that somewhere around my 28th birthday, and since then I've tried to show up, love them from a reasonable distance, and not expect things they've never been able to give. So when Daniel and Priya announced they wanted to hold their engagement party at the Hargrove Grand, I wasn't surprised. The Hargrove Grand is the nicest venue in Millvale. It opened 14 months ago. It's a converted textile mill with original brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a rooftop terrace that looks out over the river. It seats 400. It has a James Beard-nominated chef running its restaurant. It is, by any measure, the most architecturally significant building in the county. I know this because I designed it. Not the whole thing, the original structure was 140 years old, and a preservation architect handled the historical restoration elements. But the new addition, the load-bearing glass atrium connecting the old mill to the modern event wing, the rooftop infrastructure, the entire structural system of the east-facing expansion that was mine. Aldrin & Voss won the contract 3 years ago, and I was the lead engineer on the project from the first site survey through the final walkthrough. I spent 18 months of my life in that building. I know where every beam is. I know which column was poured twice because the first batch of concrete didn't meet spec. I know the exact angle of the rooftop drainage system because I argued about it with the general contractor for 2 weeks until he finally admitted I was right. My family didn't know any of this. Not because I hid it, but because I'd mentioned the Hargrove project at dinner once, early on, and my mother had asked Daniel about his gym routine. After that, I stopped mentioning it. The engagement party was on a Saturday in April. I spent that morning the way I spend most Saturday mornings: coffee, a long walk, a few hours reading. I put on my dress around 5 and drove to the Hargrove. I hadn't been inside since the final walkthrough 8 months prior, and I'll admit I was quietly looking forward to seeing it full of people. There is something deeply satisfying about watching a space you built exist in the world. I pulled into the parking lot at 6:15. The party started at 6:30. I could see through the front windows that the atrium was already lit, warm and golden, the way I'd always imagined it would look for an evening event. I sat in my car for a moment longer than necessary. Then I went inside. The lobby was staffed by 2 young women in Hargrove uniforms at a welcome table. There was a hand-lettered sign that said, "Celebrating Daniel and Priya welcome." I gave them my name. One of them scrolled through a tablet, frowned slightly, scrolled again, and said my name out loud as a question. I said yes, that's me. She said she needed to check something and asked me to wait one moment. I waited. Around me, other guests were arriving. I recognized a few of them: family, friends, colleagues of my parents, some of Daniel's friends from college. They were being handed champagne and directed toward the atrium. I kept standing at the welcome table. After about 4 minutes, an event coordinator appeared. She was in her 30s, professional, with a Hargrove lanyard and a tablet of her own. She smiled at me in a way that was careful rather than warm. She said my name. I confirmed it. She said she was sorry, but there seemed to be a discrepancy with the guest list, and she'd been asked to hold any arrivals who weren't pre-confirmed by the event hosts. She said she would reach out to the hosts right away and get it resolved. I said, "Of course, take your time." So I stood in the lobby while my brother's engagement party happened 20 feet away behind a set of glass doors. I could hear the music. I could see the shadows of people moving through the light. I checked my phone. I had no messages from Daniel, no messages from Priya. After about 10 minutes, Priya appeared. She was wearing a deep red dress, and her hair was up. She looked beautiful, and for a brief moment I thought maybe there had been a genuine mistake, that my name had been accidentally dropped from a list, that she was walking over to apologize and take me inside. She stopped about 3 feet from me. She said there hadn't been a mistake. She said, and I want to be accurate here, because the exact words matter, she said she'd asked that I be placed on a secondary list, meaning if there was space, and if Daniel specifically requested it, I could be let in later. She said she'd done this because she didn't want any uncomfortable dynamics tonight, and she hoped I'd understand it wasn't personal. I looked at her. I asked what uncomfortable dynamics she meant. She said she'd noticed at family dinners that I had a way of making the energy feel heavy. I didn't say anything to that. She said she was sure I'd understand, and then she turned and walked back through the glass doors. I stood there. The event coordinator was looking at the floor. The 2 young women at the welcome table were looking at their tablets. I thought about leaving. I genuinely considered it, getting in my car, driving home, making tea, and pretending this evening hadn't happened. I had done that before, with smaller things. With the Christmas when my parents gave Daniel a trip to Italy and gave me a gift card. With the birthday when they forgot to call until my father remembered at 10:30 at night. I had a practiced muscle for absorbing things quietly and continuing on. But I hadn't been in this building in 8 months, and I had a scheduled walkthrough. I should explain this part clearly, because it matters to the logic of what happened next. As part of the contract with Hargrove Grand, Aldrin and Voss retained a limited consulting relationship through the first 18 months of operation. This is standard practice for complex projects. There are always adjustments, warranty items, questions that come up once a building is actually in use. I had one remaining scheduled site walkthrough, which I'd arranged with the venue's operations director for that same evening. The timing had been coincidental. I'd scheduled it weeks before I knew about the engagement party, and then, when I'd received the invitation, I'd thought about moving it, but ultimately hadn't, because it was the last one and I wanted to close out the project cleanly. I had an appointment. I had a name on file with the operations team. I took out my phone and called the main Hargrove number. The woman who answered put me through to the operations director, a man named James Whitfield, who I'd worked with for the better part of 2 years. He picked up on the second ring and said my name like he was genuinely pleased to hear it. He asked if I was downstairs. I told him I was in the lobby. He said he'd come right down. The event coordinator was still standing nearby. She was pretending to review something on her tablet. I stood quietly and waited. James came through a side door about 3 minutes later. He was a tall man in his 50s, silver-haired, the kind of person who moves through a room like he's always exactly where he's supposed to be. He saw me and extended his hand. He said, "Good evening, Miss Claire. Welcome back." He said it the way you say it to someone whose name is on the building's structural drawings, with a particular kind of respect that has nothing to do with the dress you're wearing or the party you were just turned away from. The event coordinator looked up from her tablet. James asked if I'd had any trouble getting in. He said he should have left my name with the front desk. I said it was fine. He said, why didn't we start the walkthrough, and then, if I had time, He'd love to hear my thoughts on some acoustic adjustments they were considering for the atrium. I said I'd be happy to. We walked through the side door together. It led to a corridor that ran alongside the atrium, with narrow windows that looked into the event space. As we passed, I could see the party. I could see Daniel in a navy suit, laughing with someone near the bar. I could see my parents at a table near the windows, my mother in a pale green dress, my father beside her. They looked content. They looked like people who had no idea what had happened in the lobby 8 minutes ago, or who, if they did know, had decided that was fine. James was talking about the acoustic panels. I was listening. We walked through the service corridor into the east wing, and I spent the next 40 minutes doing what I had come to do, checking seam conditions along the expansion joint, reviewing some minor waterproofing concerns near the rooftop access stairs, walking the atrium perimeter with James, and looking at the areas he'd flagged. Being in the building settled something in me. I know that sounds strange, but there is a specific feeling that comes from standing inside something you made, not pride exactly, more like recognition. Like seeing your own handwriting in a letter you'd forgotten you'd written. I knew every decision that had been made in these walls. I knew the ones I'd fought for, and the ones I'd compromised on. The building held all of it quietly. We ended the walkthrough on the rooftop terrace. The sun had gone down. The river was dark, and the lights of Millvale were scattered along its banks. It was the view I had argued should face east, not west, because the evening light off the water was better than the sunset. I had been right. James said the feedback from events had been exceptional. He said the atrium in particular had gotten more compliments than any design feature in the building. I said I was glad. He asked if I'd be interested in a referral for a similar project in Chattanooga, a developer he knew who was looking for a structural firm for an adaptive reuse project. He said he'd been planning to mention it the next time we spoke. I said that would be wonderful. We stood on the terrace for another few minutes. Below us, through the atrium glass, I could see the tops of heads, the flicker of the pendant lights I'd specified, the gentle curve of the roof beam I'd drafted at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in November 2 years ago. I went home around 9:30. I made tea. I sat on my couch. I thought about Priya's face when she'd said I made the energy feel heavy. I thought about my mother in her pale green dress, looking content. I thought about Daniel laughing by the bar. I wasn't angry. I want to be careful about describing what I actually felt, because it would be easy to say I was devastated, and that would be too dramatic, and it would also be too easy. What I felt was something closer to tired. Tired of being the person in my family who could be turned away at a lobby and have it be unremarkable. Tired of being the one whose presence was categorized as a complication. I also felt, underneath the tired, something else, something quieter. The awareness that I had walked through that building for 40 minutes while my family celebrated 20 feet away without me, and I had been more at home there than they would ever understand. My phone rang at 10:47. It was my mother. I watched her name on the screen for 4 rings, then let it go to voicemail. It rang again at 10:50. Then Daniel, then my mother again. Then Priya, which surprised me, because Priya had never called me in the 2 years she'd been with my brother. I sat with my tea and looked at the missed calls. Then I listened to my mother's first voicemail. She was not calm. She was not using her measured, careful voice. She was using the voice she normally reserved for when something had gone genuinely wrong, when my grandfather had his stroke, when the basement flooded, the voice that meant the situation had exceeded her ability to manage it with composure. She said that something had happened with the venue, that Hargrove staff were saying there was a contract issue, that the event could not continue in the main atrium because of something related to permits or inspections. She didn't fully understand it, but the party was being moved to a smaller room, and it wasn't big enough for everyone, and Daniel was upset and she needed me to call her back immediately. I set my phone down. I picked it up again and called James. He answered and said he'd been meaning to reach out. He said he hoped I didn't mind, but he had looked me up earlier in the evening after our walkthrough, or rather, his assistant had, because he'd wanted to send the referral contact my way, and she had found an article from a Chattanooga architecture publication that had run a profile on the Hargrove project 6 months ago. He said the article had included a photograph of the structural team. He said that photograph had made its way, in the span of about 2 hours, through the Hargrove staff group chat. because one of the servers had recognized me from the lobby and mentioned to a colleague that the woman who'd been held at the welcome table was apparently the engineer who had designed the building. He said this had prompted a conversation at the management level about the fact that the event host had instructed staff to place me on a secondary list, and that this had occurred to several people as being, in his words, an uncomfortable situation for the venue. I said I understood. He said nothing improper had been done by the venue. Of course they had followed the host's instructions, but that the story of what had happened had spread quickly among the staff, and there had been some visible awkwardness when a few staff members made comments within earshot of guests. He said he was sorry if the evening had been unpleasant for me. I told him it was fine. I told him I'd had a productive walkthrough, and I was glad we'd gotten the chance to close out the project. He paused, and then said that one more thing had come up. There was a component of the original Aldrin and Voss contract that covered use of the structural documentation and design drawings for any future expansion or modification of the property. The venue's ownership group had been in preliminary discussions about a potential addition to the West Wing, and those discussions had assumed that the drawings would be freely available. But because of the consulting retainer structure, any new work on the building would require a fresh agreement with Aldrin and Voss, and specifically with the lead engineer who held the design file. He said the ownership group had wanted him to ask whether I would be open to that conversation. I said of course. I said I'd have our contracts manager reach out on Monday. I thanked him for the evening. I put my phone on the charger and finished my tea. The next morning was Sunday. I slept until 7:30, which is late for me. I made eggs. I opened my laptop and looked at the Chattanooga referral James had emailed over a hotel conversion project, 18 months minimum. A developer with a good track record. I forwarded it to my firm's principal with a note. My mother called again at 9. This time, I answered. She didn't ask how I was. She asked what I had done. I told her I'd had a scheduled walkthrough at the venue as part of my consulting contract. That was all. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she didn't understand why I hadn't mentioned that I was involved with the Hargrove. I said I had mentioned the project when I was working on it. She said she didn't remember that. I didn't argue with her. She said Daniel and Priya were upset. She said the party had been disrupted. She said people were asking questions. She said it was embarrassing. I asked her what specifically had been disrupted. She said the staff had made comments. That people had found out. That Daniel's future in-laws had asked questions about the family. She said it looked bad. I said I hadn't told anyone anything. I had shown up for a scheduled appointment. She said I should have warned them. She said if I had known I was connected to the venue, I should have said something. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about standing in the lobby in my black dress, while Priya told me I made the energy feel heavy. I thought about my mother in her pale green dress, looking content. I said, Mom, I did try to tell you about this project. She said she didn't remember. I said I know. She asked if I was planning to apologize to Daniel and Priya. I said I didn't think I had anything to apologize for. She made a sound that I recognized the sound she made when I had disappointed her by being, in her estimation, inflexible. By not smoothing things over the way she wanted them smoothed. I had been hearing that sound my entire life. I said I loved her. I said I hoped Daniel and Priya had enjoyed the rest of their evening. Then, I ended the call. Daniel texted me 4 days later. The text said he thought I had deliberately engineered the situation to embarrass him and Priya. He said he didn't know how I'd arranged the timing, but that it was petty and beneath me. I read the text twice. I thought about responding. I thought about explaining the scheduled walkthrough, the contract, the coincidence of the timing, all of it. I thought about writing a careful, measured message that laid out the sequence of events in a way that would be hard to argue with. Instead, I typed, I hope you both are happy. I mean that. I sent it. I put my phone down. He didn't reply. My father called 2 weeks later. This was different. My father is a quieter person than my mother, more considered, and when he calls me separately, it usually means he's been thinking about something for a while. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. He asked about work. I told him about the Chattanooga project, which we'd received a formal inquiry about, and about a mixed-use development in Savannah that our firm was shortlisted for. He listened in a way that felt genuine. Then he said he owed me an apology. I didn't say anything for a moment. He said he had been thinking about the night of the party, and about what your mother told me, not just about the Hargrove, but about what happened in the lobby. He said Priya had told your mother about the secondary list, and your mother had told him, and he said he was ashamed that he'd been sitting inside and hadn't come out to check on me. I said it was all right. He said it wasn't. He said he had spent 32 years letting your mother set the tone with you and Daniel, and that tone had not been fair to me. He said he didn't have an excuse for that. He said I had built something that people were going to stand inside for 100 years, and he hadn't even known about it, and that was his failure as much as it was anything else. I held the phone and looked out my window at the street outside. It was a Tuesday evening. The light was going the way it does in April, slow and orange. I said, "Dad, it means a lot to hear you say that." He said he was proud of me. He said he should have been saying that louder for a long time. I didn't cry on the phone. I cried a little after we hung up, briefly, and then I made dinner. I don't know what happens next with Daniel and Priya. I genuinely hope they're happy, not in a hollow way, but truly. I hope the engagement party, even in its reduced form, was beautiful enough for them to look back on with warmth. I'm not going to pretend I feel nothing about what happened in that lobby, but I've also stopped expecting that feeling to be resolved by anyone other than myself. What I know is this. I built something that is going to stand. People will hold their weddings there, their retirement parties, their fundraisers. They'll stand on the rooftop terrace in April and look at the river and feel something they can't quite name, but that is partly the result of the angle I chose and argued for and refused to compromise on. They won't know my name. They don't have to. James sent me the Chattanooga developer's contact. We had a call last week. They want to move forward. My father texted me a photo on Friday. It was an article from the local Millvale paper about the Hargrove Grand's first full year of operation. The article mentioned the structural expansion and included a quote from the venue's ownership group about the design. My father had circled my firm's name in the article. He'd printed it out and circled it in pen, then taken a picture of it and sent it to me. He wrote, "Saw this. That's my daughter." I stared at that text for longer than I'll admit. I didn't show it to anyone. I saved it, the way you save certain things not to use, just to return to on the days when the weight of being overlooked feels more than usual, like it means something. It doesn't mean something. I know that. But on the days when I forget, I'll have it. I went into the office on Monday and told my principal about Savannah. I told her about Chattanooga. I sat at my desk in the late afternoon and looked at the structural drawings for the next project, a library addition, a school in Augusta that wanted a new gymnasium, a small things and a large one, and I felt the specific satisfaction of a person who knows exactly what she's doing and does it well. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to be the one who holds the room up. I learned that a long time ago. I just keep learning it in new ways.